Somewhere between the Tigris and the Caucasus Mountains, 10,000 years ago, someone made a mistake that would outlive every empire built after it. A jar of wine, left open, left too long. By the time anyone noticed, the wine was gone, replaced by something sharp, something that stung the nose and puckered the mouth. To the person who found it, this was ruin. Spoiled. Worthless. Picture the moment. The lid comes off, and instead of the sweet, familiar smell of wine, there's something biting, almost aggressive, rising out of the clay. Every instinct says throw it out. Every instinct is about to be wrong. High voltage, here's the strange part. That ruined wine is still sitting in your kitchen right now. You probably used it last week. This is the story of vinegar, the ingredient nobody invented, that no king ever commissioned, that no empire ever fought a war over. And yet it outlived every empire that tried. So what actually happened in that jar? And why did it end up feeding armies, powering surgeries, sinking pirate legends, and seasoning sushi 3 continents and 10,000 years later? Let's go back to the accident. Picture a settlement on the edge of the Caucasus, sometime around 6000 BCE. Archaeological evidence places some of the earliest winemaking here, in what is now Georgia and Iran. Grapes crushed, juice fermented, wine stored in clay vessels sealed against the air. Except sealing was never perfect. High-voltage wine and vinegar are separated by one thing: oxygen. Nothing else. Leave a jar open, let bacteria called acetobacter reach the alcohol inside, and within days the wine begins converting itself, molecule by molecule, into acetic acid. No ritual, no recipe. Just air doing what air does. Somewhere a person will never know their name, so let's call her the brewer, because someone in every settlement held that job. Pulled the lid off a jar and recoiled. The smell alone would have told her something had gone wrong. Sharp, biting. Nothing like the wine she remembered sealing away. She stopped. She didn't pour it out. That single hesitation, taste it before you waste it, is arguably the moment vinegar enters human history. Not a eureka, a shrug that turned into a habit. Because here's what she would have noticed next. Meat soaked in this ruined wine didn't rot as fast. Vegetables kept longer. The sting on an open wound seemed to calm it rather than worsen it. High-voltage historians of food culture make a striking point here. Vinegar has no single inventor, no single birthplace. It was independently rediscovered everywhere fermentation existed. Date wine in Mesopotamia, rice wine in East Asia, grape wine in the Caucasus. Different people, different continents, the same accident, arriving at the same discovery without ever meeting. The brewer didn't know she'd found one of the oldest food preservatives in human history, centuries before refrigeration, before the sealed can, before anyone had a word for expiration date. She just knew the ruined wine was somehow useful. And useful things don't get thrown away. They get remembered. There's no name attached to this moment. No monument. No inscription. That's what makes it different from almost every other origin story in human history. The wheel, the plow, writing itself all eventually get credited to someone, some culture, some place. Vinegar doesn't work that way. Wherever people learn to ferment something, grapes, dates, rice, honey, the same accident was waiting for them patiently, in every jar left open a day too long. High voltage, ask yourself this. How many world-changing discoveries actually started with someone trying to avoid waste, rather than someone chasing greatness? Vinegar might be the oldest example of that pattern we have. By 3000 BCE, vinegar wasn't an accident anymore. It was infrastructure. Babylonian cuneiform tablets, dated to roughly 5000 BCE, describe fermented date drinks that scholars believe were used, among other things, as a base for vinegar production. In Egypt, physicians reached for it constantly, not for flavor, but for survival. High voltage, ask yourself, what do you use to clean a wound before antibiotics exist? Egyptian sources point to vinegar, used to rinse injuries, mixed into medicinal pastes, trusted as an antiseptic thousands of years before anyone understood why it worked. They didn't know about pH. They didn't know acetic acid creates an environment most bacteria simply cannot survive in. But they watched wounds treated with vinegar heal cleaner than wounds that weren't. And in medicine, watching is often enough to build a practice on, long before you can explain it. Imagine an Egyptian physician working by lamplight, cleaning a soldier's wound with a vinegar-soaked cloth, having no idea what a microbe is, only knowing this. The wounds treated this way don't turn black and rot the way the untreated ones do. He repeats the treatment tomorrow. He teaches it to his apprentice. 3,000 years pass before anyone can explain, in scientific terms, exactly why he was right. In Greece, the man historians call the father of Western medicine put his name behind it directly. Hippocrates prescribed oxymel, vinegar cut with honey, for coughs, for fevers, for general weakness. Strip away the centuries, and it's not so different from what someone's grandmother still swears by today. There's a stranger story attached to this era, and it's worth pausing on. Not because it's true, but because of what it reveals. The Roman historian Pliny the Elder recorded a legend. Cleopatra, at a lavish dinner, allegedly dissolved a priceless pearl in a cup of vinegar and drank it, just to win a bet with Mark Antony over who could host the most expensive meal in history. High voltage, most historians doubt this actually happened. Ordinary table vinegar dissolves pearl far too slowly to make for good theater. But notice what the legend assumes. That vinegar was common enough, recognizable enough, that a story about it could travel across the ancient world and still make sense to everyone who heard it. That's not a myth about a queen. That's a myth about how ordinary vinegar had already become. By the time the Book of Ruth describes field laborers dipping bread into vinegar as a simple, unremarkable meal, one thing is clear. This was no longer a discovery. It was a habit stitched into daily life across 3 continents. Rome inherited vinegar from Greece. Then it did something Greece never did. It put vinegar in a soldier's canteen and marched it to the edges of the known world. It was called posca, water, cut with sour wine or diluted vinegar, sometimes sharpened with herbs. High voltage, here's the detail that should stop you. Posca wasn't the drink of emperors. It was the drink of the ordinary legionary, the standard issue ration for the men doing the marching, the digging, the dying at the edge of empire. Why? Because water on campaign was often unsafe, and a soldier who drank the wrong water didn't die in battle. He died in a ditch days later from dysentery. The acidity in posca made contaminated water marginally safer to drink. It was cheap. It traveled as concentrate. And an army, more than anything else in history, runs on what's cheap and what travels. There's one mention of posca that carries more weight than any military record. Gospel accounts, and the historians who study them, still debating the details, describe posca as the drink offered to a condemned man on a cross outside Jerusalem. Not wine. Posca, the soldier's ration, the cheapest thing on hand. High voltage, think about what that detail tells you. If posca shows up in one of the most retold scenes in Western literature, it wasn't rare. It was so ordinary that no one questioned why it was there. Off the battlefield, vinegar seasoned nearly everything. The surviving Roman recipe collection attributed to Apicius calls for it constantly, as marinade, as sauce base, as the thing that turned tough meat edible and bland food sharp. For Romans, vinegar did what a squeeze of lemon does for us now. It wasn't confined to the kitchen either. Roman sources describe vinegar used to scrub away limescale, to clean and preserve weapons and armor against corrosion. Even, in some accounts, historians treat with real caution, since the texts blur into legend, as an engineering tool for breaking down limestone. Roman writers on agriculture, including Columella and Cato the Elder, left detailed instructions for making vinegar at home, which tells you something important. By the 1st century BCE, this wasn't a guarded secret. It was common knowledge owned by anyone with a vineyard and a spare barrel. Then, in the 5th century, Rome fell. Libraries burned. Trade routes collapsed. Centuries of engineering knowledge simply vanished with the institutions that had recorded it. Vinegar didn't vanish. It was too simple to lose. Too stitched into daily survival to need an empire to protect it. Passed quietly from one farmer to the next, no scholars required. Fast forward to medieval France. A city on the Loire River called Orléans. By the 17th century, this city didn't just make vinegar. It smelled like it. A permanent, low haze of fermentation drifting off dozens of workshops lining the riverbank, day and night, for generations. Here's how it started. Orléans sat on the trade route carrying wine from southern France to Paris. Some of that wine spoiled in transit. Some never sold at all. Rather than dump it, local craftsmen began fermenting it deliberately, slowly, in oak barrels exposed to air, seeded with something called a mother, a living bacterial culture passed down like a family heirloom. This became known as the Orléans method. Took weeks, sometimes months, far slower than anything that came after it, but producers still swear it produces something richer, rounder, more complex than speed can buy. Picture one vinegar maker's workshop. Barrels stacked 3 deep, the air thick enough to sting your eyes, a father showing his son exactly how much of last year's mother to save for next year's barrel. Because if the culture dies, the whole batch dies with it. This wasn't a factory. It was closer to a bakery or a vineyard, a craft passed hand to hand, not written down because everyone assumed it always would be. Consider what that means. An entire industry, running for centuries, built on knowledge nobody bothered to write down, because nobody imagined a world where it might be forgotten. By the 16th century, records show an official Orléans vinegar guild, regulating quality, training apprentices, controlling trade. Vinegar had stopped being a byproduct. It had become an industry with its own laws. By the 17th and 18th centuries, city archives suggest dozens of vinegar workshops were operating simultaneously along the riverbank, which is why an entire city, for generations, simply smelled like fermentation day and night, whether you worked in the trade or not. And it wasn't only food. Vinegar dyed fabric, tanned leather, scrubbed limescale from kettles. During plague years, when nobody understood contagion but everyone understood fear, vinegar-soaked cloths were used to disinfect coins, door frames, sick rooms, a practice medieval doctors couldn't explain but somehow empirically kept reaching for. They didn't know why it worked. They just knew that when they used it, fewer people around them got sick. The age of exploration created a problem humanity had never faced at this scale. How do you keep food edible for months? In the heat, in the damp, packed below deck on a wooden ship crossing an ocean with no end in sight? Salt handled some of it. Salt didn't handle everything, and salted rations got old fast in every sense of the word. Here's the number that should unsettle you. Scurvy killed more sailors during the Age of Sail than storms and naval battles combined. Ship logs from European fleets describe vegetables and meat pickled in vinegar before long voyages, not as a cure, but as a way to make food last. And some captains noticed something they couldn't fully explain. Crews eating pickled vegetables seemed to survive the crossing better than crews who didn't. We know now why. Pickling preserved trace amounts of vitamin C longer than plain salting did. But no 18th century captain knew what a vitamin was. They just watched, kept records, and repeated whatever seemed to keep men alive. Imagine being the ship's cook on a 6-month crossing. Rationing barrels of pickled cabbage you don't fully understand the value of, only knowing that when you run out, men start getting weaker, their gums start bleeding, and nobody can tell you why. That's the terrifying part of this chapter of history. People were saving lives with a tool they didn't understand, using a method that worked by accident, centuries before science caught up to explain it. Picture the hold of a ship somewhere in the middle of the Atlantic. No fresh food left. No land in sight for weeks. Barrels of salted meat, some of it starting to turn, and beside them, barrels of vegetables pickled in vinegar before departure. The cook's only real defense against a crew slowly falling apart around him. He doesn't know the word vitamin. He only knows this: the men who eat from the vinegar barrels seem to hold up better than the ones who don't. That single, unexplained observation, repeated voyage after voyage, quietly saved more lives than most naval battles of the era ever cost. Here's a fact that should genuinely surprise you. It would take until the 20th century, nearly 200 years after sailors were already pickling vegetables to survive long voyages, for science to formally isolate vitamin C and explain, in molecular terms, why the trick had worked all along. On land, England was building its own vinegar tradition. Malt vinegar, fermented from barley, sharp and unmistakable, destined to become the standard companion to fish and chips for centuries to come. And on the other side of the world, entirely without contact, China had already been fermenting rice vinegar for over 1,000 years. Chronicles from the Zhou dynasty describe it as an established craft. The city of Zhenjiang would eventually become to Chinese black rice vinegar what Modena is to Italian balsamic: slow-aged, culturally central, fiercely protected. Food historians note that the Zhenjiang method, involving lengthy aging and fermentation, mirrors the spirit of the Orléans method almost exactly, despite the two traditions developing on opposite sides of the planet centuries apart, with no shared lineage whatsoever. In Japan, rice vinegar became the seasoning behind sushi, originally not for flavor first, but to help preserve fish before refrigeration existed. Long before sushi became a global phenomenon served in glass display cases, it was a practical survival technique. Acidified rice, buying a fisherman's catch a few more precious hours before it turned. Two civilizations, an ocean apart, never trading recipes, arrived at the same solution to the same problem. That's not coincidence. That's chemistry finding the same door from opposite sides of the planet. For 10,000 years, people used vinegar without knowing what it actually was. That changed with one French chemist and one word. Antoine Lavoisier, one of the founders of modern chemistry, was among the scientists who studied the composition of organic acids in the late 18th century, including the one responsible for vinegar's bite. It finally received a formal name, acetic acid, from the Latin acidum, simply vinegar. For the first time, the ghost that had haunted kitchens, hospitals, and ships for millennia had a name and a formula. And once you can name something, you can speed it up. In the 19th century, a German engineer developed what became known as the quick method, pumping alcohol through a chamber packed with wood shavings colonized by acetic bacteria, dramatically increasing contact with oxygen. What once took months now took days. Picture the shift. A process refined over centuries by hand, in oak barrels passed down like folklore, compressed into an industrial process in a matter of decades. Walk into one of the first vinegar factories built on this method, and the scene would feel almost unrecognizable compared to the quiet, patient barrels of Orléans. Rows of tall wooden vats. The constant trickle of alcohol pouring down through packed beechwood shavings. Workers monitoring temperature instead of tasting for readiness. The same chemical transformation the Caucasian brewer stumbled into by accident, now running on a schedule on a factory floor, measured in hours instead of months. The Industrial Revolution finished the job. Factories began producing vinegar at scale, from grain, from sugar beets, even from wood processing waste, not just wine. What had been a farmhouse craft became a mass commodity sold by the ton. Economic historians point to something important here. This is the moment vinegar split into two separate products: cheap industrial vinegar made fast and traditional artisanal vinegar made slow, the way Orléans always had. That divide still sits on grocery store shelves today, in the gap between the bottle that costs $2 and the one that costs 40. By the 20th century, a technique called submerged fermentation compressed the process even further. Bacteria cultured directly inside a constantly stirred, aerated tank, cutting production time down to hours. 10,000 years of trial and error, and a process that once took an entire season now finishes before a single work shift ends. Chemistry could even manufacture acetic acid synthetically now, from petrochemical sources with no fermentation at all, chemically identical, but in most countries, legally barred from being sold as food-grade vinegar, which by law must come from biological fermentation. It's a strange legal distinction. Two molecules, atom for atom identical, treated completely differently depending on whether bacteria or a chemical plant produced them, because in most regulatory frameworks, the word vinegar is protected specifically for the product of living fermentation, not synthetic replication. 10,000 years of trial and error, compressed into a factory process that runs while you sleep. You've probably never thought about why there's a bottle of vinegar under your sink and another one in your pantry. Here's why that split exists, and it's older than you'd guess. From the 16th century until well into the 20th, long before modern disinfectants and antiseptics existed, vinegar was one of the only universal household substances a family could reliably afford. Cleaned windows, descaled kettles, disinfected children's toys during outbreaks of illness. One recipe in particular carries a legend worth telling. For thieves' vinegar, an herb-infused blend supposedly formulated by a group of plague-era robbers who used it to protect themselves while looting the bodies of the dead. Medical historians are skeptical of the thieves themselves. It's a good story more than a documented fact. But they don't dismiss the vinegar. Herbal vinegar blends really were used as disinfectants during plague outbreaks, and there's likely a genuine antibacterial effect behind why people kept reaching for them. Picture a household during an outbreak generations before anyone understood germ theory. A mother wipes down the door frame with a vinegar-soaked rag before her children go to sleep. Not because a doctor told her to, but because her own mother did the same thing and her mother before that. Nobody in that house could explain what they were fighting. They just knew that vinegar was one of the few weapons available to ordinary people against a threat they couldn't see. In rural households across the world, vinegar remained the primary method of preserving a harvest for winter, long after refrigeration existed in cities but hadn't yet reached the countryside. Pickling recipes passed from mother to daughter, unwritten, memorized. The same kind of quiet, hand-to-hand transmission that carried vinegar making itself through the fall of Rome. This is still happening. Right now, in kitchens across Eastern Europe and Asia, someone is pickling vegetables using a method passed down exactly this way, not out of nostalgia, but because it still works. In the 20th and 21st centuries, vinegar pulled off its strangest transformation yet, from invisible pantry staple back into a subject of genuine culinary obsession. Italian balsamic vinegar, aged for years, sometimes decades, in wooden barrels in the Modena region, achieved international status as a delicacy. Regional food historians trace the tradition back centuries, but it didn't reach true global fame until Italian cuisine itself went global in the second half of the 20th century. Here's a number worth sitting with. Some traditional balsamic vinegars are aged for over 25 years before a single bottle is sold. Picture a producer in Modena walking through a loft of wooden barrels. Not one barrel, but a graduated series of them, each smaller than the last, made from different woods: oak, chestnut, cherry, mulberry. Each year, a portion of the vinegar is moved from the larger barrel into the next smaller one, concentrating and complicating the flavor as it goes, evaporating slowly through the wood. A bottle finished today might contain vinegar that started fermenting before the producer's own children were born. Meanwhile, apple cider vinegar built its own reputation in North America, credited by some with a wide range of health benefits. a few supported by limited research, many still debated among nutritionists. It's worth being direct here. Scientific consensus on many of these claims hasn't been established yet, whatever the internet tells you. So here's a question worth asking before your next viral health trend. If a claim about a 10,000-year-old ingredient only became common knowledge in the last 5 years, who's actually making that claim? A scientist or a marketing department? What's undeniable is what happened in professional kitchens. Chefs rediscovered vinegar not as a condiment, but as a tool, what they call working with acidity. A few drops cut through fat, sharpen sweetness, tame excess heat, add a dimension that's hard to build any other way. In this sense, modern fine dining circled back to exactly what Roman cooks understood 2,000 years ago. There's a newer trend worth mentioning too. High-end restaurants fermenting their own house vinegars from apple scraps, grape pressings, even leftover beer, treating it less like a purchased ingredient and more like house-baked bread or house-aged cheese. Part of a broader farm-to-table movement built on locality, minimal waste, and a return to slow, hand-made technique. Walk into one of these kitchens today and you might find a young chef doing exactly what that unnamed brewer did 10,000 years ago on the edge of the Caucasus, leaving a jar of alcohol open to the air on purpose this time, waiting to see what it becomes. The only difference is she's writing the results down, adjusting the temperature, timing every stage. The accident has become a method. The mistake has become a craft passed down in cooking schools instead of farmhouses. 10,000 years after a jar was left open by accident, chefs are deliberately leaving jars open on purpose, chasing the exact same accident on purpose in a Michelin kitchen. The story of vinegar spans 10,000 years, and it starts with a mistake nobody bothered to fix. It cleaned wounds in Egypt. It marched with legions across Rome, kept sailors alive when nobody understood why. It filled the streets of Orleans with the smell of patient craft. It became, eventually, a tool sharp enough for the world's finest kitchens. And here's what makes this story different from almost every other one in history. It has no single center, no single inventor to credit, no war fought over it, no empire that claimed it as their own. While Orleans aged wine in oak, Zhenjiang fermented rice. While Modena sweetened grape must into balsamic, English taverns poured malt vinegar over fried fish. Cultures that never traded a single recipe kept arriving, independently at the same answer because fermentation obeys the same chemistry everywhere, and the need to preserve food and sharpen its flavor belongs to every human being on every continent. It outlived every empire that tried to claim greatness, not because anyone decided to protect it, but because a simple reaction between alcohol and oxygen turned out to be too useful for humanity to ever let go. Think about what usually survives 10,000 years. Stone monuments, buried tombs, fragments of language carved into rock, deciphered centuries later by specialists. Vinegar survived by doing the opposite, by staying so ordinary, so unremarkable, so present in every single kitchen on every single continent, that no war ever needed to be fought over it, and no empire ever needed to protect it. It survived by being useful to absolutely everyone, all the time, with nothing to steal and nothing to conquer. Today, when you splash vinegar into a salad dressing or a marinade, you're repeating a gesture first made by an Egyptian physician, a Roman legionary, and a French craftsman in Orleans, none of whom ever knew about the others. Food history is rarely written by kings or battles. It's written quietly, in jars, barrels, and kitchen pots, left in the sun a little longer than they should have been. Maybe that's the real lesson here. Not every world-changing discovery starts in a laboratory. Sometimes it starts with someone too stubborn to throw something away. That discovery spreads quietly, through trade caravans, tavern kitchens, a ship's cook's notes, a physician's ledger, until it becomes so ordinary that we stop asking where it came from at all. Vinegar is exactly that kind of discovery. Invisible, everywhere. And 10,000 years later, still sitting in your kitchen, waiting for you to notice it again. If this journey through one of the most overlooked ingredients in your kitchen kept you watching until the end, hit subscribe. There are more of these coming. And in the comments, what's the next forgotten ingredient you want us to dig into?